They sat me at the kids' table and called it a joke. But the wedding was happening on land I owned, in a barn my husband built with his own 2 hands, and by the end of that night, they'd learned that jokes have a way of finding their punchline. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 73 years old, and until that Saturday in September, I believed my son loved me the way I loved my own mother, without conditions, without a ledger, without a joke that cut close enough to draw blood. I'd been up since 4:30 that morning. Not because anyone asked me to, because that's what I do. I set tables. I've been setting tables for this family for 40 years, ever since my husband Robert and I built the reception barn on the back 40 of our property, the one we always called Whitfield Hollow. We built it for our own wedding anniversary parties first, then for Robert's retirement, then for every christening and graduation this family ever had. It had good bones and better memories, and when my granddaughter Chloe got engaged, there was never a question in my mind where she'd get married. I offered the barn before she even asked. I didn't charge her a dime. I spent $11,000 of my own retirement savings on the string lighting, the reclaimed wood tables, the flowers, because I wanted her to have the wedding her grandfather would have wanted to see, if he'd lived long enough to walk her down that aisle himself. By 5 that morning, I had 62 place settings laid out on 12 farmhouse tables, each one wiped down twice. Each fork aligned the way my own mother taught me, tines down on the left, the way she said a woman shows respect for the people she's feeding. I'd hand-lettered the name cards myself the night before, my arthritis screaming through every curl of the calligraphy pen, because Chloe said she loved my handwriting and wanted it on every single card. I placed mine at the head table, 3 seats down from the bride, next to my son Daniel and across from his wife Renee. That's where I put it. That is not where I found it that evening. By 4 in the afternoon, guests were arriving in sundresses and pressed suits, and I was still in my apron in the barn kitchen, finishing the last trays of deviled eggs because the caterer Renee hired had shown up 2 people short of staff. Nobody asked me to cook. I just did, the way I always have, because somebody has to hold a family together, and it's rarely the people who get thanked for it. When I finally untied my apron and walked out into the barn to find my seat, my name card wasn't at the head table anymore. It was at a low round table near the back, decorated with crepe paper and crayons in mason jars, sat beside 4 folding chairs sized for children. 2 of my great-nephews were already there, 6 and 8 years old, coloring on butcher paper someone had taped down as a tablecloth. And right there, wedged between a booster seat and a coloring page of a castle, was a card in my own handwriting. Eleanor. I stood there a long moment, waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake. Renee found me first. She smiled the kind of smile people wear when they already know they've done something and are hoping you'll be too polite to name it. Oh, don't take it personally, she said, laughing lightly, touching my arm like that would soften it. We just needed the head table for the wedding party and close family. You understand. It's kind of a joke, actually, the grandma table. The kids love you so much. We thought you'd want to sit with them. I looked past her to the head table, where 2 of Chloe's college roommates were already seated in chairs meant for family, laughing over champagne. Where's Daniel? I asked. Renee's smile flickered, just barely. He agreed it made more sense this way, Eleanor. Space is tight. You know how these things go. I did not know how these things go. Not this way. Not from a son I raised alone for 6 years after his father's first heart attack nearly took him, back when Daniel was 11 and I worked 2 jobs, so he'd never once feel what we were losing. Not from the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in this very barn, back when it still smelled like fresh-cut lumber and sawdust and his father's cologne. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that about me before this story goes any further. I have never once in my life made a scene. I sat down at that little round table, next to 2 children who didn't understand what had just happened, and I folded my hands in my lap the way my mother taught me, and I smiled for the photographs. But inside, something that had been quiet in me for a very long time started, very calmly, to wake up. Because what Renee didn't know, what none of them stopped to remember in the rush of centerpieces and seating charts, was that Whitfield Hollow wasn't just sentimental ground. It was still, on every deed and every document filed at the county courthouse, mine. Every acre, every beam in that barn. And in my handbag, tucked beside my reading glasses, was the business card of a man named Arthur Pell, the attorney who had helped me draft the very agreement that let this wedding happen there in the first place. An agreement that, as it turned out, had a clause in it nobody at that head table had bothered to read. The wedding continued around me the way weddings do, the vows, the applause, the flash of cameras, while I sat at a table built for children I love, watching my family celebrate as though the woman who paid for the flowers and built the barn with her late husband's own sweat had simply evaporated from the guest list of her own life. I want to tell you something about grief, because grief isn't only for the dead. There's a kind of grief that comes from watching people you raised decide, quietly and without a vote, that you've become optional. It doesn't arrive with a slammed door. It arrives with a joke, a laugh. A folding chair sized for a 6-year-old, set beside a woman who remembers exactly what it cost to build the room they're standing in. I thought about my husband Robert while I sat there. He built that barn with reclaimed barnwood from a dairy operation 2 counties over, hauling it himself in the bed of his truck because we couldn't afford to hire it done. I remember him standing in the frame of it at dusk, sawdust in his hair, saying, "Someday this'll hold every wedding this family ever has, Ellie." I remember thinking he meant it as a gift to all of us. I don't think either of us ever imagined it would become the thing used to prove exactly how disposable I'd become. Around 6:30, the toasts began. Daniel stood up with a glass of champagne, and for one foolish moment, I let myself hope he'd mention me. He didn't. He thanked Renee's parents for flying in from Arizona. He thanked the caterer. He thanked Chloe's college roommates for organizing the bachelorette trip. He did not once look toward the back of the room, toward the table where his mother sat holding a plastic cup of lemonade because there hadn't been a wine glass set out for the children's table. That's when I stood up. Quietly. I didn't say a word to anyone. I walked to the barn doors, out into the cooling evening air, past the string lights I'd hung myself 2 weeks earlier on a ladder that Renee told Daniel was, quote, a liability with Grandma's balance these days. I was 3 steps from my car when a voice stopped me. "Mom, don't leave yet." It was Harold Harris, my neighbor of 31 years, standing near the parking area in his good church suit. Harold had known Robert since before I did. He'd watched this family grow up over the fence line between our properties. He'd been invited as a family friend, and he'd clearly seen more of what happened inside that barn than I realized. "I saw where they put you, Eleanor," he said, low enough that no one else would hear. I saw the whole thing. I told him it was fine. I told him I didn't want to make a scene at my own granddaughter's wedding. Harold looked at me the way an old friend looks at you when he knows you're lying to protect everyone but yourself. "You built that barn with Robert's own hands," he said. "You still hold the deed on that land, don't you?" I didn't answer right away. Harold had been at our anniversary party 11 years earlier, the one where Robert, half joking and half not, told the whole family that Whitfield Hollow would always belong to whoever remembered to take care of the person who built it. Everyone had laughed. Nobody had written it down, except that actually someone had. 3 years after Robert passed, when my health had a scare of its own, I sat down with Arthur Pell, and I did write it down. I put the land and the barn into a living trust, with a single condition attached to any use of the property for a paid or hosted event. Written permission from me, revocable at any time, for any reason, at my sole discretion. Arthur had said it was standard for a woman my age holding valuable land, protection in case anyone ever tried to pressure me out of what was mine. I remember laughing when I signed it, telling him nobody in my family would ever need that kind of protecting against. I stood in that parking lot with Harold, and for the first time all day, I let myself feel exactly how wrong I had been. I gave my permission for this wedding in writing, I told Harold slowly, which means legally I can withdraw it just as easily. Harold didn't smile. He just nodded once, the way men of his generation do when they understand a decision has already been made and don't need to hear it explained twice. I didn't go home. I sat down on the tailgate of my car, opened my handbag, and took out my phone and Arthur Pell's card. My hand wasn't shaking, which surprised me. I think I expected it to. Instead, it felt steady, the way it used to feel setting a table at 5 in the morning, certain, practiced, sure of exactly what came next. Arthur picked up on the second ring. I could hear him settle into what I imagine was his study chair. Eleanor, he said, it's a Saturday evening. This must be important. Arthur, I said, watching the golden light spill out of the barn windows, hearing the laughter of a party that had made a children's table out of me. I need to talk to you about Whitfield Hollow. Tonight, if you're able. Arthur Pell had drafted enough family trusts in his 40-year career to know that a phone call at 7:15 on a Saturday evening from a client's voice gone flat and even meant something had finally broken that couldn't be unbroken by an apology at brunch the next morning. I told him everything. The card at the children's table. Renee's laugh, calling it a joke. Daniel's toast that thanked a caterer and 2 out-of-state in-laws but couldn't find 30 seconds for his own mother. Arthur listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers and good friends both know how to do, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said, you understand what you're asking me to do.
Ida.
The written use agreement gives you the right to revoke permission for tonight's event, effective immediately, at your sole discretion. I drafted it that way because you asked me to protect you from exactly this kind of situation. But I want you to sit with it before I act. Revoking it mid-reception isn't symbolic. It's real. It affects vendors, insurance, 60 guests standing on your land. I looked back at the barn. Through the windows, I could see Chloe dancing with her new husband, unaware, innocent in all of this. I thought about her for a long moment, because whatever her parents had done to me, my granddaughter hadn't chosen where they sat me. She hadn't seen the card. And I want to be honest with you. Some part of me almost hung up the phone right there, almost told Arthur to forget it, to let the night finish for her sake. But then I thought about the $11,000 for my retirement account. The eggs I cooked at 4 a.m. because a caterer came up short. The 40 years I'd spent making sure this family had somewhere warm to gather, and the folding chair sized for a 6-year-old that had been my seat of honor. I thought about Robert, standing in the frame of that unfinished barn, telling me it would belong to whoever remembered to take care of the person who built it. Nobody at that head table had remembered me all day. Not once. Arthur, I said, I'm not asking you to end the wedding. Chloe's already married. That part's done, and I'm glad of it. I'm asking you to enforce the agreement on the reception. Effective tonight. Arthur exhaled slowly. I can have the notice delivered within the hour. I know the venue coordinator Renee hired. I'll call him directly, so this is handled properly, not chaotically. But Eleanor, once I send this, there's no quiet way to walk it back. Everyone in that barn will know it came from you. Good, I said, and for the first time all day, my voice didn't waver. I'd like them to know. I stayed on that tailgate with Harold while Arthur made his calls. It took less than 40 minutes. I watched through the wide barn doors as the event coordinator's phone buzzed, watched the man step outside, watched him speak quietly with Renee, whose face went from confusion to disbelief to something colder as the words landed. I watched her scan the parking lot until she found me, still sitting on my tailgate in the September dusk, and I did not look away from her. Daniel came out next. He crossed the gravel lot at something close to a run, his tie loosened, his face pale in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy running to me after a nightmare. Mom, he said. What did you do? I honored the agreement I signed with your father's memory, I said. The same agreement that let this wedding happen here for free in the first place. You're going to shut down Chloe's reception? Tonight? Because of a seating chart? I looked at my son. This man I'd raised through his father's illness, through every scraped knee and broken heart of his childhood, and I felt something in me that wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. The kind that only arrives once you've stopped hoping to be understood and started simply telling the truth. It was never about a seating chart, Daniel, I said. It was about being told, in my own handwriting, at the place I built with your father, that I don't belong at my own family's table. I spent this entire day proving I still deserved a place in this family. Tonight, I'm done proving it. I want to tell you what happened next because it wasn't the scene Daniel and Renee were bracing for, and it wasn't the scene I expected either. Arthur arrived himself, in person, 20 minutes later, in a gray suit and the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure other people's worst days went as smoothly as possible. He didn't storm into that barn. He walked in quietly, found Chloe and her new husband first, and spoke to them privately before he said a word to anyone else. I watched from the doorway as my granddaughter's face changed, not with anger at me, but with something that looked, for the first time that day, like understanding. Arthur explained, gently and without theatrics, that the venue use agreement required continued written permission from the property owner, that the owner had exercised her right to revoke it, and that the reception could conclude that evening, but no future events could be held or advertised as taking place at Whitfield Hollow without renewed written consent. Guests were free to finish their meals. The bar would remain open another hour, at my instruction, because none of this was Chloe's fault, and I never wanted my granddaughter's wedding night remembered as the night her grandmother made a scene. Then Chloe came and found me, still sitting outside with Harold, her wedding dress gathered in one hand as she crossed the gravel in the dark. "Grandma," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that told me she'd already heard about the seating. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know they moved you." I believed her. I still do. I pulled her into a hug, careful of her dress, and I told her the truth, that none of what happened that night was about her marriage, and that I loved her the same as I had the day she was born, in the very barn where she'd just said her vows. Renee never apologized that night. I don't know that she ever fully understood what she'd done, or perhaps she understood it completely and simply couldn't stand to say so out loud. But Daniel came to my house 3 days later, sat at my kitchen table, the real one, not a folding chair, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, he cried in front of me the way he did as a boy. He told me he'd let his wife make a decision, he should have stopped the moment he saw the seating chart, and that watching his mother sit at a children's table in her own handwriting had been the moment he finally understood what he'd let this family become. I didn't take back the barn out of spite. I want to be clear about that because I know some of you watching have already decided this was revenge, and I understand why. But it wasn't. It was the last lesson I had left to teach a son who had somehow forgotten the first one I ever gave him, that love isn't measured in what people say about you in a toast. It's measured in whether they remember to save you a seat. Whitfield Hollow still stands. I renewed the family's right to use it 2 months later, this time with one new clause added to the agreement. One Arthur insisted on, and I gladly signed. Any family event held there requires a seating chart approved by me, in advance in writing. Nobody has ever needed to ask why. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever been the one quietly holding a family together while everyone else forgot to save you a seat, you're not alone, and it's never too late to remind them who built the room.